Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you all to Durham University and to the Department of Physics for the 2023 Cigarra-Roberts Lecture. My name is Dan Atkinson. I'm the Cigarra-Roberts Professor of Applied Physics, and that title enables me to organise the Cigarra-Roberts Lecture every year. I'd like to say that I organise it. I organise it on behalf of the Department of Physics and the Department of Engineering. But in reality, there is a team of people who will help to organise this. I'd particularly like to thank Christine Elliott, who has been the real functional organiser of this, with support from our department manager, Claire Davies. And if you know your technician's commitment, you know that technicians make it happen. And we have a big shout out to our technical team, particularly Stephen Berry, who's at the back. Vicky Greener and Greg Robson, who are here today. So they are the people who were able to then provide all of the audiovisual and etc. that we have. This lecture series was instigated as a tribute to the life and work of the late Sir Gareth Roberts. Gareth joined Durham University in the mid-1970s as a professor of applied physics, when we then had a department of applied physics, which was a kind of a joint between the physics and engineering type of activity. While he was here, he developed this international reputation for leading research, and on the basis of that, he became a fellow of the Royal Society. But as a true applied scientist, he actually went on from that to work in industry, and he moved across actually to be the director of research at Thorn EMI, which was a very large company at the time. He did that in the mid-1980s. He went from industry back into academia. He became the Vice Chancellor of Sheffield University, and ultimately at the end of his career, he took up the Master he was President of Wolfson College, Oxford. So a very distinguished career, but he's notable by this synergy and overlap between his academic and his industrial work. And that overlap between academia and industry actually also led him to become very much involved in public outreach, public understanding of science, encouraging young people to think about career, particularly in the applied sciences. And also, it led him into public policy. So he was actually a member of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Science and Technology in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. He was famous for his policy work for the Success Report, that's about the supply of scientifically skilled people, which led to the Research Council's investing at that time 120 billion or so, which became known as the Roberts money. So he had a really phenomenal career and across a very broad range of components of what we consider a scientist and engineer to do. And it's in that spirit of his role and contributions, societal contributions, that this lecture series was developed. And we've attracted some outstanding speakers, people who made a significant, widely recognised contributions within STEM, within industry. And last year, we had the postponed 2020 lecture. James O'Leary spoke about the role of nuclear power and his contribution to net zero. And before that, Nigel Shadwell talked about the importance of engineering and its role in artificial intelligence. And then the year before that, a lecture was presented by Dame Julia Higgins, who's a very well-known polar scientist, neutron scientist, and a proactive leader for women in STEM, which is very appropriate on today's days. She was, in fact, the first Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society as well. So, in that spirit of outstanding societal contributions, we have our 2023 speaker, Anna, my colleague, Professor Regard, introduced this year's speaker.
I'm attached to the microphone. Welcome, everybody. So we're very grateful to be joined today by Fiona Worrell, Member of Parliament for Newcastle Central, Shadow Minister for Science, Research and Innovation. She's chair of various all-party parliamentary groups, including the Diversity Inclusion in Science, Technology, Engineering and Maths, and vice chair of the Internet, Communications and Technology Group. She's a rarity in Westminster. And she's a chartered engineer who's worked as an engineer in industry. Holds a BEng in Electrical Engineering from Imperial College, an MBA from Manchester Business School. She's a Fellow of the Institution of Engineering and Technology, a campaigner for increasing diversity within the engineering profession, and has been named as most influential politician in UK tech by Computer Weekly. In fact, top 50 most influential person in the country, as the only politician in that list, I think. Prior to joining Westminster, she worked for the telecoms regulator Ofcom and was head of telecoms strategy, focusing on the regulation of next generation networks. Next generation networks that we're using today, now. Her links to Newcastle go back much further than her election as MP in 2010, however. She grew up in Kenton and attended Kenton Comprehensive School. In fact, we have at least two, graduates of Kenton Comprehensive School in the audience today, because our very own Professor Del Atkinson, the Sir Gareth Roberts Professor of Applied Physics, lived just a few streets away from Chi, although I don't think we met. Until now. There we go. How the world's come back together again. Chi's first engineering job after leaving Imperial was with Northern Telecom Europe at the time, kick-starting the transformation of their communications infrastructure from the analogue world to the digital era that we're in now. For context, this was the late 1980s, early 90s, when those of us who were lucky enough to have a computer at home had to choose between voice calls or the shrill sound of our modem dialing up to bulletin board services that are now long forgotten, thankfully. Today, we're reliant on digital signals. The stream of ones and zeros flowing through the networks that are transporting the encoded information reliably, securely, over phenomenal distances. Without the move to digital networks enabled by what she and her colleagues, we would not have online meetings, the Internet of Things, and the seemingly ubiquitous smart devices. Now, I note with interest that she has expressed many reservations about the risks of smart devices and data security and eavesdropping potential. So I apologise to you for any smart devices that are in front of you during this lecture. But what I can guarantee is that anybody, no matter where they're listening to this talk, will be paying 100% attention to your words. And on that note, I hand over to Chi Murrow. Thank
you. Well, thank you so much for that fantastic introduction. I don't think they're the best introductions, almost complete introductions that I ever received. And it's a huge pleasure to be here this afternoon and to be invited to the Department of Physics here to give the Sir Gareth Roberts Memorial Lecture. And obviously I always, regularly, twice a week indeed, pass through Durham on the way between Newcastle and Westminster. But it's a real treat to actually get off the train and come here to speak in this iconic part of the North East. And I also say that after the week that, the half week that I've had in Westminster, when we've had the small boats bill, that triumph of politics over sense, as well as a science framework which had very little durable science to it. It's really great to be here and to be faced by a room full of engineers and scientists. I'm not giving anything away if I say that when I face the Conservative benches in Parliament, they are not as evidence-based and scientifically skilled, let me say, trying to be part of that, as you are. And it's also the opportunity to talk about my very favourite two subjects, favourite also because I know something about them, which always helps, engineering and politics. And as Andrew said, I am a proud chartered electrical engineer, and after studying at Imperial, studied electrical engineering, I spent 20 years building and designing the networks which have become the internet. in the private and in the public sector, and I've now spent 13 years as an engineer in the House of Parliament. And of course, today is International Women's Day, which is a brilliant opportunity to celebrate the contribution that women have made and encourage greater contribution from women. So I think it's particularly appropriate for me to share with you my journey through engineering and politics and what I've learned about both of them. I think I'll recognise a number of themes, and I'll be interested afterwards to hear what conclusions you draw. Just the great thing, actually, I mean, one of the consequences of the recognition of the importance of conservation of energy, not just as a principle of physics, but as a reality of a world facing climate change, is that most electronic devices take a little bit longer to get going. Now they do. So, I should start by, I was one of those annoying children who knew what I wanted to do from a very early age. And I can't say exactly what inspired me to go into engineering and science. There weren't any engineers on the council estate in Newcastle where I grew up. That's a photograph of it there. We had great teachers at my state primary school. And I remember very clearly learning about Archimedes and how, sitting in the bath one day, he realised that the amount of water he had displaced was equal to his volume, and then ran through the streets of Syracuse shouting Eureka. So I rushed home and filled the kitchen sink with water and set about submerging all manner of my mum's pots and pans. She wasn't too pleased about that, but I said she should be grateful that I wasn't running around naked. I was also very aware of our great industrial heritage in the North East, exemplified by George Stephenson there, who grew up just a few miles away from me in Wylam, and was the founding president of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. I mean, he grew up poor too, as I was, but he didn't exactly look like me. I think it's difficult to identify what inspires children to follow a certain career. Is it seeing Philip Albert lob the ball into the back of the Manchester United goal to make it 5-0 to Newcastle? I don't know why that particular example I find really inspiring at the moment. Perhaps not. But whatever it is that inspires young people, I don't think you can't identify it systematically, and so that's why exposing young people to as many different experiences and opportunities as possible is so important. So, for example, 2001 was one of my favourite films as a child, but then so was National Velvet, and I never thought about becoming a jump jockey. We have to ensure there's a wide range of experiences for all, for children from all backgrounds, in order to ensure that they can meet, their potential and have the widest career opportunities possible. So for whatever innate or learned reason, I wanted to be a scientist or an engineer from a young age. Now, the kids in the playground at school didn't think girls could be scientists. Indeed, actually, they didn't think girls could do maths. I remember being told that. And I suffered from what I now call Marie Curie syndrome, which is the inability to name more than one female scientist or engineer. So what I wouldn't have given then to know about Rachel Parsons, who was the world's first marine engineer and the founder of the Women's Engineering Society, and actually grew up in Heaton, just a few miles down the road from me. But back then, stories like that were not told, and the contribution of women to engineering and science was truly marginalised. And we all today have a responsibility to help in changing and indeed making up for the centuries of neglect. And I was helped in my quest for a science-driven career by great teachers, and my mother made sure that I believed I was capable of anything. And she was supportive of my being an engineer, but she wasn't exactly thrilled by it. She was a big fan of Jean-Paul Sartre, who said, and I quote, "The dreary world of means and the means of means was left to the engineers." And so my mother, I suppose, she didn't want to lose me to the dreary world of means, and I guess that's why she gave me Sartre's collected works for my 11th birthday. She made so I was also interested, in the theatre, politics and culture. But I will say that I think that she and Sartre were fundamentally wrong on this point. And it really annoys me that those who see a sort of a division between the creativity of the arts, which I love, and the dullness of the practical things that actually make a difference in people's lives. And I think the media is particularly guilty of this, and I always send off a letter of complaint to whatever channel it is when I hear something like, so-and-so wanted to do something creative, so abandoned their engineering studies and ran away to the circus. Both science and engineering are creative, and I'll come back to that. So it's now almost 40 years, it's quite hard to believe that, but it is, it's almost 40 years since I entered Imperial College as a student. I didn't know it at the time, but I was joining a profession which was an engineering profession with a deep culture of what one might call blind constructivism. We build things and we don't ask why or who benefits or what the consequences are. I remember it was a big thing when they introduced in my course at Imperial a course called Engineering for Design, as if the idea that engineers might think about the way things were designed was radical. The idea of ethics never came up. And it's funny how, for me, this culture was really at odds with what I grew up with in Newcastle. The work of Newcastle North East engineers, the Institute of Mining in Newcastle began to address health and safety issues in Newcastle's in the North East mines, and that is actually what gave rise to Newcastle University. And the railroads, the electric lights, the turbine engines, all those transformed the world in both good and bad ways. Coal heated houses, heated homes, very important, but that began the process of climate change, connected nations and helped some nations subjugate other ones. So my whole life in science and engineering and politics has taught me that science and engineering has unavoidable ethical and political content, that it matters who does science and engineering, it matters who controls and profits from the pursuit of knowledge, and it matters who benefits from and who is harmed by our acquisition of scientific knowledge. We live in a country that has made an immense contribution to science and engineering. We are a world-leading science nation. And it in turn has been shaped by those contributions. As a nation, we only have the wealth and comfort which many of us enjoy today because of science and engineering. And we also have massive inequalities of wealth and power because of those who control scientific knowledge and how it has been used. And yet it often seems that we think that these achievements are part of our past, or that science and engineering are a kind of background activity that requires no leadership, no support, no strategic thinking on the part of government, particularly this government. But Labour sees things very differently. We've learned from our experience as a nation in recent years of COVID, of climate change, of growing tensions with authoritarian states. We see science and engineering as central to Britain's future and central to the world's future. When I look at you, scientists, engineers, many young scientists and engineers, I do really, and it's great to see a diverse mix of participants here. I see, our hopes as a nation and as a world, but these hopes and these possibilities can only be realised if we lift the blinders of the past, if we understand that we desperately need science and engineering that addresses the challenges we face, and doesn't make them work. Challenges like stopping climate change and feeding the world's hungry, and challenges like addressing the inequalities of wealth and power, defending democracy, and protecting our people from disinformation. And we need all of our people engaged. Women and men of every race, religion, background, ability, disability, sexual orientation. I joined the Labour Party when I was 16. That was 2 years before I started at Imperial. Back then, 14% of engineering students were women. Almost 40 years later, that figure has climbed to 18%. That's half a percentage point per decade, and at this rate, I calculate it will be 27-41, well past the realm of science fiction, before we reach gender parity. This is it's not just unfair, it's bad for our economy, it's bad for our society, and it is bad for our global competitiveness. So I didn't expect engineering to be diverse. I did look at the Imperial perspective, and I saw the photographs in there. But I couldn't have imagined just how undiverse it would be for just how long. I also didn't realise how tiring it would be just, to be the only one in the room, the only woman, the only person of colour, the only Geordie, the only Newcastle United fan, I would go, for example, and speak at a conference of 2,000 engineers, and they would all remember me, not necessarily for the quality of my presentation, but because I was the only black woman there. And I wouldn't necessarily remember them, and that was an advantage and a disadvantage, because obviously they remembered me was good, but they thought I was rude for not recognising them each individually. But I had to understand also that when I walked into a room, a lot of assumptions entered the room with me. And so you've been wondering why I have Sherlock Holmes up there. Well, that is because if you saw the series of Sherlock, you'll know that it portrayed that Sherlock's inferences and conclusions about somebody would be sort of swirling around that person's head when he was talking to them. What I had to understand that what swirled around me was not, my experiences or what I've been doing, but it was people's own stereotypes, assumptions that might not be explicit, in fact, often were not explicit. Was English my first language? Did I apply to study engineering just to find a rich husband? That really was said to me at Imperial, and I have to tell you, it took me a while to recover, particularly given the person who said it to me. But anyway, did I later, when I was I really a qualified engineer? I think it's really important to recognise the biases and assumptions and stereotypes, of the world or the society or the culture or the room that you're in, without internalising them. Don't inhale. A year ago, I did the Life Scientific with Jim Al-Khalili, which is fantastic, Jim. And I spoke about my experiences at Imperial, the racism and the misogyny. And some of the most, I got a lot of response to that. And some of the most moving responses for me were fellow students who got in touch to say how much they wished that they had called out what at the time had made them uncomfortable, but they had been reluctant to speak up against it. And moments like that occur throughout your life. Something that science and engineering are in some way separate from politics and political choices. Those choices are always around you. You may not be aware of them, but they are always there. So, in 1987, I graduated, and as Andrew said, I went straight into a job with Northern Telecom. And I remember when I told my mum, she was so pleased. She said, "So you'll be back in the north then?" I had to explain it was the Northern Hemisphere. And actually, the job was in Hemel Hempstead. So at Northern Telecom, or Nortel as they called themselves after a while, I designed what was then the world's smallest primary rate ISDN board using, and that's what you can see there, double-sided surface mount technology, printed circuit board. So IFDN, or Integrated Services Digital Network, as Andrew said, was the first standardised attempt to move communications from the analogue to the digital world. So the ability to take something analogue, and make it digital, that was the beginning of the world that we live in now, where everything is digital twins. So basically on a board, and that's about the size of an A4 piece of paper, I was able to put, with all that fantastic design work, I was able to cram in there 32 different voice calls and control them through the microprocessor, where they went, and something about the quality of them. Now, that was absolutely revolutionary at the time. 32 calls on one small board. Now you could probably get about 1,000 calls on a board of the same size, but you wouldn't want to, because everything is data now. Those calls themselves are simply compressed into data. And that's part of, it's been amazing to be part of the evolution of the telecommunications sector in that way. So as an engineer, I worked all over the world. I worked in hardware and software development, product management, market development and strategy for private sector companies that's London, in Paris, in Singapore, in the US, and in Nigeria, and also in Denmark. And my last role in the private sector was in Nigeria, working for what was then a small startup by the name of MTN, building out Nigeria's first GSM network, and that is actually the backbone of that network illustrated there. And one of the reasons I accepted the job was that my father, from Nigeria, Chion is the name that those who are Nigerian will know. And at the time, after about 100 years of fixed networks in Nigeria, penetration was 1%. So only 1% of people in Nigeria had access to telephony. And that was an economic as well as a social issue. But in just 2 years, the GSM network that I helped build out took that to 10%. And now mobile penetration in Nigeria stands at around 82%. So it was quite inspiring to see the difference it made. You didn't need to drive through Lagos, risking 3 to 5 hour traffic jams to explain a new product or set up a meeting, and more importantly in some ways, to try and get a doctor to attend your pregnancy or birth. Farmers in rural areas could find out the cost of produce in city markets, and so be less liable to get a better price, be less liable to be conned out of their price, get a better price locally. And my father was living in Nigeria at that time. I was living in a place called Orca, which you can see is on that network backbone. And I was able to hand to him a mobile phone and say that because I was managing the network rollout, I knew that the mobile phone would work in 2 months' time. And it was the first mobile phone in that area, and he would be able to call me on it. And he was incredibly proud, and I was incredibly proud. And he wanted me to be a doctor, because that is what most Nigerian families want their children to be. And so I was actually a rebel, by being an engineer. People always need doctors, they think, but handing him that phone, finally, he did say that perhaps engineering was useful. And then my final job, what my constituents still call my final proper job, before going into Parliament, was in the public sector as head of technology at Ofcom, which is the Office for Communications. And so that was looking at next generation networks. And at that time, the UK led the world in communications regulation. And we moved from a monopoly ration broadband to real infrastructure competition, low prices, and some of the highest broadband speeds in Europe. How things have changed. This thing at the time, there's this thing called the internet, which was just getting mainstream attention. Facebook had only been launched 1 year, and Google was just 6 years old. And the engineering joke, and you all in this room know that engineering jokes, well, not many of them, they don't tend to be that funny, but the engineering joke at the time was that 3G, which was the mobile internet standard, stood for girls, gaming and gambling. because they were the only sources of revenue on the internet. Now, internet companies, Google, Meta, Apple, Amazon, have the biggest revenues on the planet, not all taxed, but their revenues are larger than many small nations. But in that period, there has been no regulation for the internet. Of course, all existing regulation did apply to the internet, but even getting that recognised was a real battle in the early days. The Silicon Valley tech types found it hard to accept that. But there's been no regulation designed for the internet, its unique strengths and threats, and even the Online Harms Bill, which Boris Johnson as Prime Minister said would be on the statute by Christmas 21, it's still not in place. And the fact that 13 years after I left Ofcom, we haven't seen any coherent regulation of the internet has, in my view, been almost criminally negligent. So I've repeatedly called for clarity over critical questions like responsibility of the tech giants, like who controls the data we all, leave, the data trail we leave, like how to protect children on the internet, what safeguards need to be in place. But that's actually getting us onto politics. And so I'll just tell you about how I got into politics. So I'd always thought, I joined the Labour Party when I was 16. I'd always thought that representing Newcastle would be, the very best job in the world. But I didn't think it was for me. I mean, I had no idea how to go about it. And I guess I thought that if I was meant to be an MP, some big hand would come down from the sky and would say, you should be an MP. And it was only the fuss about all-women shortlists that persuaded me to find out what the process actually was. And all-women shortlists came about in the Labour Party because the long-serving MP, Harriet Harman, who is now the mother of the House, she calculated that without them it would be 300 years before we got fair representation of women in Parliament. And if it wasn't for all-women shortlists, I wouldn't have stood for selection in Newcastle Central. I would have assumed that some man had already been tending the constituency for years, getting to know all the right people. And I wasn't going to throw my hat into the ring if somebody had already bought up the circus. Now, I do want to say that in retrospect, I think I would have had a really good chance in an open selection, but I didn't know that at the time. I underestimated my abilities, and I think I overestimated the requirements of the job. And now, don't get me wrong, because being an MP is a really challenging job, and a job in politics isn't easy at all. But I suppose I overestimated it because I thought you had to be perfect and a genius. Now, a quick look at some of the male politicians at the time would have convinced me that that wasn't true, but I didn't know any politicians. And I entered Parliament just after the expenses scandal, when the reputation of politicians was probably at the lowest it's ever been, although some are trying to get it lower now. And when I announced to my engineering colleagues that I was running for office, I'll tell you that the main response was one of disgust. How could I leave a reputable and useful profession like engineering for the disreputable and chaotic realm of politics? I actually think the response would have been more positive had I said I was running away to join the circus. I think that's what some people thought I actually was doing. But I knew that engineering and politics weren't separate spheres. And I talked earlier about my Labour values and how they were connected to my vision of science and engineering. And I know that particularly being in Nigeria, taught me I could design the best broadband network in the world, and I still think I possibly could. But whether it was built, who used it, who could afford to buy services on it, and who had the skills to benefit from it, they were all political decisions. Now, I didn't go into politics because I wanted to represent engineers or be the voice of engineers and scientists. I went into politics because I wanted to represent the people I grew up with. That's what I told the voters of Newcastle, and that is absolutely what I want. And what I meant. And winning the election was the proudest moment of my life. And I remember a few days after I was elected being asked to open an office in the centre of Newcastle, Princess Square. And I turned up there, and there's bunting, and there's a sizable crowd, and a photographer with the longest telephoto lens I've ever seen. And I think, oh my gosh, somebody important must be coming. And then I slowly realised that the important person was me. Because I represented the people of Newcastle Central. And that was what made me important. But I did go through a period of grieving for not being in an engineering environment anymore. And that was premature. Increasingly over my time in politics, science and engineering has risen up the agenda. Science is at the heart of so many of our biggest challenges, such as climate change, healthy aging, shared prosperity. And you who are entering upon a scientific career, or a science-enabled career, just at a time when the world needs more science and more engineering, that's a fantastic opportunity. And I always say that I entered politics for exactly the same reasons I entered engineering, to make the world work better for everyone. But the truth is that many people still don't think science is for them. A recent study by CASE, the Campaign for Science and Engineering, found that people often see the wealthy and big businesses as the main beneficiaries of research and development, and particularly the under 40s and those on lower incomes least likely to think R&D helps people like me. And I know I have many constituents who just don't trust technology. They're afraid that Google is following them, Amazon is listening to them, Facebook is helping groom their children, and TikTok is exploiting them. And certainly, the vast amount of data held by companies is a cause for concern. So, for example, Uber knows when your mobile phone battery is about to die. Is it okay for them to use that data point and the implication that you're desperate for a ride home to raise their price? And who should decide? So the emergence of data-dominant firms has to be accountable, especially when products are integrated with others. And I'll just say, we talk about an example. Another example would be broadband. It's my specialist subject. 47% of households without full fibre optic access. This is the worst one. 22% do not have digital skills to be digital citizens. I was speaking at the Elders Council in Newcastle recently, and there's a woman there who said that she couldn't afford broadband. She didn't know how to use a smartphone, even if she could afford one. But if she didn't pay her bills online, she had to pay more. Right? So, broadband was not for her. And you take another example would be HS2. Which is supposed to address the regional inequalities, but then they go and abandon the eastern leg being scrapped. So if HS2 is not coming to the northeast, how is it for the northeast? And perhaps an example from further afield. Research in February 2018, researchers from Harvard unveiled a system that had designed to automatically detect gang crime, but the problem was that biases can be built into these, they aren't actually designed into these algorithms, they're training data, leading to racial profiling on rigid stereotypes and the perpetuation of harms to already minoritized communities. Now, one of the project's computer scientists was asked about this, and he said, "I'm just an engineer." I suppose my question to you was the engineer wrong? Here we've got the founder of the Hippocratic Oath, which doctors follow. There's not such an oath for engineers or scientists, but the innovation economist Mario Mazzucato says that innovation has a direction as well as simply a rate. So it's not something that just happens to the world, it's something that we develop and for whose impact we are responsible. Now, engineering is made for people, not people for engineering. And speaking as a politician as well as an engineer, I think we actively need to consider the impact of engineering on people's lives. And I'll just, my final example, if you like, which is my favourite one, comes from Apple. So the Apple Health app, their beta version, it was meant to reflect all aspects of a user's health. So it used your temperature, your weight fluctuations, exercise, diet, sleep patterns, etc. And it did reflect your health if you were a man. They forgot about periods. And the reason they forgot about periods was because not one person on the design team had ever had one. And not thought about thinking about those who had. So technology will reflect the demographics it's designed by, and when it's designed largely by white, male, relatively well-off engineers, it will reflect their concerns. So, we need to look also at the regional distribution, and this is this slide shows the Golden Triangle, which is where 20 billion of UK research and development funding is targeted. Only 0.7% goes to the north. And innovation and science are critical to building regional economies which are strong and self-sufficient. And we have to champion regional universities and university clusters like as we have in the northeast to build economies which are integrated in local communities and with local and regional supply chains. And finally, actually, in terms of the challenges that we talk about, I want to talk a little bit about climate change. Because if innovation has a direction, then saving the planet has to be a pretty important direction for it to take. And I always remember meeting a group of civil engineers at an Extinction Rebellion protest, and didn't involve anything illegal like gluing myself or anything, but I met a group of civil engineers, and them saying to me that they just wanted to be given the go-ahead to act on behalf of the most important client in the world. The world. And it's clear that climate change is simultaneously the greatest engineering problems and one of the greatest political problems we have. We have built a world of technology based on fossil fuels, and now we need to re-engineer it, and to do it fast, or we will endanger the very civilization our technology created. And the Industrial Revolution, which I certainly argue in many ways was born here in the northeast, it caused climate change, and we should be at the centre of a green industrial revolution to address it. And but like many great challenges, it can only be addressed with political consensus, and we need a government with takes aggressive action to stabilise our climate, but that has to have popular support, and that won't be forthcoming unless that action is combined with public investment policies and labour policies needed to make sure that the new zero carbon jobs are at least, or in fact are not just as good as the jobs they're replacing, but better by them. In fact, better by them rather than they are. And that means putting our engineering talent to work on solving the climate crisis in a fairly distributed way among all the people whose talent and labour will go into creating that wealth. So I spent a lot of time talking about some of the challenges, both in terms of the diversity of engineering and science, and also the challenges that we're addressing, the challenges that the world faces. And I'm very aware that I'm speaking at a time when average wages are less than they were in 2010, and the first thing that's on most people's minds is the cost of living crisis. Now it's my job to develop labour, science and innovation policy. And obviously my approach to that is shaped by my journey to this position. And as I've said, I believe passionately that engineering and politics are the twin engines of progress. But we have to ask, progress for whom? Answering that question demands evidence, it demands imagination, it demands creativity, and it also demands insight into real people's lives. And we certainly can't do that when we're always reacting to the nearest crisis and lurching from crisis to crisis. So instead, we need a strategy, a long-term vision, by which we can ensure that innovation benefits all. And so that's why Labour is proposing a mission-based, driven government approach which will end the sticking plaster politics that we see and place the question of who is it for at the very heart of government. And I'll just talk, these are the 5 missions that you may have heard from Keir Starmer announced. I want to just talk a little bit about the first one. The second one was the clean energy by 2030. I think I talked about the importance of climate change and engineering. But the sustained high growth, having the highest level of growth in the G7, that means we can only do that with the good jobs and the productivity that comes from that if we are driving growth in every part of our country. And that means that there's science and innovation, which are the engines, of that growth. They have to be driven. They have to have access to the capital, the skills, the support that they need, the infrastructure across our country, across our whole country. And that's what my policies, the Shadow Science Minister, are really looking at. How can we ensure that the great science that comes out of Durham University, for example, is integrated into the local economy in driving great spin-out startups and new jobs? So that's why our sort of mission for the country has science as its heart. And that's how we design politics for a world that works for everyone. And through the vital role that innovation plays, we can make fair growth happen. And engineers and scientists are absolutely crucial to that. So, it's been a great pleasure to be here with you today. I hope you found something of interest in my sort of journey. And I hope my experiences of engineering and politics as you chart your own career. As a species and a nation, I've set out some of the challenges we face, but there's no doubt in my mind that you will have choices to make in how you contribute and shape the impact of science and technology on all our lives. From sharpened stones to mobile phones, as a species, we have always innovated to make our lives better. But not everybody has benefited equally or even at all. How science shapes our world is a political and ethical choice, and I believe it is your choice. Thank you very much.
This microphone, I think. So, thank you very much for the speech, talk. We have an opportunity now for questions from the audience.
You mentioned growth in G7. What does that actually mean in a real sense? What will we see happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that we talk about the highest level of growth in the G7. But I go door knocking in Newcastle every weekend, and that is not what people ask me for, the highest level of growth in the G7. But what that means, I said that the average wages in Newcastle, and I think in Durham as well, are less than what they were in 2010 in real terms, whereas prices have gone up. So what that means is that people are poorer than they were. But if we had an economy which had grown at the average level of growth over the preceding 13 years, under Labour, people's average incomes would be £10,000 a year higher. So that's one of the things that it means. It means that when your economy is growing, then people's wages and incomes are going up. But it also means that companies are creating. That's why I talked about sustainable, long-term, green growth. They're creating new jobs, so people have jobs that they can go to, which they can be proud of. It also means that we have the money, the tax revenues, to invest in the public services that people also need to improve. The National Health Service, which is an ongoing sort of challenge in terms of supporting an ageing population, but also huge opportunities in what can come from the application of technology to the NHS. So the highest growth in the G7 says that we will be making up for the lost years and growing faster than our competitor countries, and that will make a real difference to people's wages and public services and the things that matter to most people.
If we're going to grow the fastest in the G7, how are you going to ensure the growth is clean? Like a growing economy for most of history and in most places in the world comes with growing emissions. How can the government legislate to keep the growth high but also green?
Well, no, that's another great question. We have made a commitment. In fact, even this government, the Conservative government, has made commitments with regards to emissions and going to net zero. And in fact, you can grow and have reducing levels of emissions, and that's why we have set out that we've committed to £28 billion per year investment in green growth, so like in green technologies, in making sure that our energy system is carbon neutral. One of the biggest and most important things is actually just insulating people's homes properly. That would significantly cut down in certain areas of emissions. And also, we need to make sure, and I think this is a question that the companies, they are reporting their emissions accurately, and they are companies, new businesses, the startups that we're seeking to support, that they are committed to net zero as well. And I've got to tell you, I went to COP26, I wasn't that convinced, but I do think we're seeing a change in the attitude of certainly some sections of business, not all, towards the importance of green, sustainable growth.
You mentioned that when you went from engineering to politics, you agreed there was a change of environment. And I was wondering if you had a sort of similar grief when you moved from Newcastle down to London.
Wow, what a great question that is. I mean, I've got to tell you, it wasn't. So I've moved from Newcastle to London. I've moved from London to Paris, from Paris to London, from London to the US, Washington DC, and also to Nigeria. The biggest culture shock I've ever experienced, and I've moved from the private sector to the public sector. The biggest culture shock I've ever experienced was moving to London. It was partly because I was only 18 or 19. I'd grown up in what I like to, think of as the socialist state of Newcastle back in the 70s, and it was really my first experience of an environment where everybody wasn't, if you like, committed to equality of opportunity and access. As I say, I talked about the racism I also experienced in Newcastle, but in Imperial, I suppose what shocked me the most was that it was people in authority. So it was professors, it was who were being racist, whereas in Newcastle, it would be kids in the playground, and the teachers would be much more supportive. The other thing that shocked me was public transport, which didn't work. Though actually we've got that in the northeast now as well. But I grew up in Newcastle. We had an integrated transport system. I hadn't learned to drive. I got my job in Hemel Hempstead, and I realised I had to learn to drive within 6 months. So yeah, it was a big culture shock, and I'd be interested to know whether there's a culture shock also coming the other way.
I wanted to go back to, you made a point quite early on in your slides about the proportion of women on engineering courses.
Yes.
And how it's changed in 30 years. And it's so depressing. And it's so depressing. And I guess I naively thought it was better than that. And you didn't list, the proportion of people of colour within engineering courses.
No.
My suggestion is it's probably also equally depressing. So your slide says over to you. So I'm an educator here, right? So I'm an entrepreneur in the Department of Physics. Many of our colleagues here as well who work in engineering physics. And I think it's probably not just our problems to solve, but probably we have a role in solving that problem. Mm-hmm. So based on your experience and your feelings and what you've seen, what should we be doing? What can we do better?
That's a great question, and I always think it's great that you asked that question, because it is depressing. But I tell you the issue, the thing that depresses me the most is when people who are active in the sector say that it's not our problem, it's the schools, or it's the nursery schools, or it's the home environment, or it's television. I mean, those all play parts. But I do think there is much that we can do, everyone can do individually. So I think part of my role is to talk a lot about science as much as I can, and encouraging women and girls underrepresented people into science. I think in the Department of Physics or in the Department of Science, I think there's two or three big things you can do. I think you can celebrate and champion the women that you have, and ensure that you have in place the network and the support for them. Because I think one of the things that I've learned most is how threatening it feels to feel that you're on your own, and how important it is to feel that you're supported and to be able to exchange experiences with others, so that women and those underrepresented groups. I think you also should need to be looking at everything that you put out to the outside world, your perspectives or your communications, and see how that reflects the kind of department that you want. And I also think, I could go on this for a long time, so I said 3, but I think it's actually 4. I think you also need to be, and I'm sure you're doing this, but engaging with schools and, about physics and about engineering, and with people who young people can identify with. And then finally, I also think we can all be talking up. So it's part of my role, but everyone can be talking up the role that science plays. Not something that happens in sort of ivory towers, but something that changes people's lives. One of my big things is actually, climate change is really inspiring to so many young people, and that's not gender dependent. And to the role that science, physics, engineering plays in addressing climate change, for example. So those are some things. Another thing I would say is get in touch with the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Diversity and Inclusion in STEM, which I chair, and we have regular reports and seminars on this subject.
Hi, thanks for the talk, I really enjoyed it. You talk about sort of the unethical practices involved with big data and the idea of a Hippocratic oath for engineers. If lots of the large revenue lies in these companies handling all our data, is there a way we can balance this unethical practices with trying to generate revenue and bring in growth into the UK? How far do we go in inviting people in? If Facebook wanted to open an office in central Newcastle, bring jobs and prosperity, how do you balance sort of the unethical practices that they may be involved with against the benefit to regional economies and the UK as a whole?
That's another fantastic question. It's a great question. I suppose there's a number of things to say. The first thing I want to say about that not all Facebook's practices are unethical, or not all Google's practices, and that also that the absence of a proper regulatory framework means that the decision about what is ethical or what is right is for every engineering scientist, as I said, but it shouldn't be only left to them. There does need to be a regulatory framework, and one of the things, one of the sort of the missions that we have in our industrial strategy is called Data for the Public Good, and that is it's almost exactly to your point, because so many of the jobs that matter in the future are going to rely on data, but also so much of the innovation that can make our lives better, whether it's in targeted treatments for cancer or in the NHS, or whether it's knowing, a bus, knowing that you're waiting for it so that it can slow down and pick you up. So much of that relies on the free flow of data, but that will not, unless people trust the environment, the data environment, that won't be inclusive, and it also won't have people's buy-in. So I think the first thing, and this is what you say, is to have what we call a settlement for the digital age, which establishes the regulatory framework which can give people trust and confidence in how their data is being used, and agency, and also give big companies like Facebook and Google confidence and knowledge of what the dividing lines are. And I will say the Online Harms Bill, which I talked about, which I don't think goes far enough and is has some of the worst aspects of bureaucracy and not enough actual agency. At least it is a step in the right direction. And if I have spoken at one of a number of Facebook seminars with businesses, for example. One of the problems under this government has been there's been very little investment in digital inclusion and digital skills. And so the fact that Google and Facebook are supporting small businesses to go online, I think that's a good thing for my constituency. It's a good thing that it's access that I wish there was more that the public sector is doing to support that. But I will support what Facebook or Google or TikTok are doing, which is positive economically and positive in terms of the abilities or the opportunities for my constituents, whilst also very much supporting and calling for, and if we are in government, we will be moving towards a proper regulatory framework for those businesses. And I just to sort of say finally, when I think there has been a recognition that the absence of regulation for so long has damaged technology, it's damaged technology's reputation, the trust people have in technology. And I think there is a much more appetite, if you like, for appropriate regulation. And I think we see that with AI, where there's a lot of discussion about the right regulatory framework for AI. Whereas in the early years of the internet, there was like, no, we can't have regulation. Regulation will just close down on innovation. I think there's more recognition, certainly on my side of the house. You have to talk to Tories to say, I think there's more recognition, much more recognition of the need for an appropriate regulatory framework.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, so you mentioned how the East Coast HS2 was just scrapped.
Yeah.
I was wondering how you ensure that your plans to achieve net zero are immune to politics.
Oh gosh. Well, I mean that's a great question. And the fact is that they haven't been immune to politics, clearly, because we've had within the same government, if you like, the same Conservative government, we've had sort of let's get to net zero. We've had David Cameron saying it was all green crap. We've had changes from we've had economic illiteracy. So I think and that's part of what I was saying. It is not immune to politics. It is not immune to politics, unfortunately, because the planet depends on it. It's not immune to politics. But what we can do is make sure that we have, if you like, the transformation of the economy that we need to a net zero economy, which still supports good jobs and standard of living. So we can give that the investment and the research and the resources and the infrastructure, which means, if you like, that the momentum is much harder to stop. So if you've got £28 billion worth of investment going into green technologies and addressing climate change every year, that means you are building up an ecosystem of companies and people and skills with an infrastructure which is much harder to turn around. So and I'm just going to say also that if it was immune to politics, that would mean that you, as a citizen with the right to vote, you couldn't influence it. It's not going to be immune to politics, but we can embed it, and I think we can do that in in the time frame, which means that we don't have the experience, the worst scenarios of climate change. But that's political decisions which are being taken here, they're being taken in the US, they're being taken in the European Union, and they are not immune to politics. So I suggest you get into politics and make sure that you're on the side of addressing climate change.
So I wanted to ask what fraction of MPs have some background in science and technology. Is that a big problem, or just a problem? Is civil service expertise enough to fill the gaps?
Okay, I think we're good. I am going to ask you, just because on the questions of being this, does everybody agree with my proposition that ethics, engineering and science are related? Or does anybody disagree with that? Oh, okay. Well, there we are. I was preaching to the choir and I didn't even realise that. Okay. So the proportion of it's another great question. I've got to tread carefully here in the way in which I respond to it. So there are I believe I'm the only chartered engineer in the House. There are members of Parliament who have experience in engineering and science, but it's not. The Campaign for Science and Engineering has done the figures, and it's not. It's as far. I think it's about. From memory, it's like a fifth of the number who, in fact, less than that, who are lawyers, for example, or have experience of PPE or policy development, and then those who have actually got working experience. So there's a number who have engineering or science degrees that may not have used it. Those who've got working professional experience is less still. And I think that's an issue for three reasons, actually. I think firstly because, Westminster is meant to be representative. I think the proportion of jobs, of people in this country who have jobs or want jobs which are science-driven or science-based is a lot higher than the proportion of MPs who are science-driven or science-based. And that differential is going to get bigger unless we get more scientists and engineers into Parliament, because the proportion of jobs which are based on science and engineering is going to go. And the function of a representative Parliament is to be representative. So I think that's an issue. And the second reason it's an issue is because, as I said, so many of the challenges that we face have science or engineering at its core. And I'll say this, very specifically, understanding statistics and maths. I was joking about the Poisson distribution before we came in here. Let me tell you, that is not a joke I can make in Parliament. And I think an understanding of math statistics, what is data, what is evidence, and what is anecdote. That's really important. So was that three reasons? I can't remember what reason. Was it two? It's not representative. The challenges are science and engineering based, and but even where those challenges aren't science and engineering based, an understanding, if you like, of the scientific method, I think, is really important. And I don't think that the officials do a fantastic job. And we have an organisation called the Office of Science and Technology, Parliamentary Post, which does a fantastic job of giving briefings. But you need. So the fourth thing is that we need to talk about science and engineering for it to be democratically relevant, and for the public investment that goes into science and engineering to be justified. And if we don't have more people standing up in Parliament and talking about science and engineering, then the public's commitment and engagement to all that tax money going into science and engineering may falter. So I can't remember whether that's 3 or 4, but it's a number of reasons why I do think we should we should see politics as a potential scientific career.